Okay, let's just jump right into this
Yeah,
one.
let's do it.
Because it is February 25th, 2026. And if you have a moment, I want you to just mentally rewind the clock a little bit,
Just a few years.
right? Think back to the narratives surrounding Canada on the global stage around, say, 2023 or 2024.
It wasn't exactly a highlight reel for us.
No, it was brutal. I mean, the word freeloader was getting tossed around in diplomatic circles constantly.
Like a baseball?
Exactly. There was this pervasive sense that Canada was, the person at the NATO dinner table who just conveniently forgot their wallet when the check came.
Oh, absolutely.
We were being heavily vilified for this chronic underfunding of defense.
And that tension wasn't subtle either. It was actively threatening trade deals. We were seeing Canada getting frozen out of security pacts like AUKUS, for example.
Right.
It was a genuine diplomatic crisis.
But fast forward to today, the headline isn't Canada lags anymore. The new headline is Canada mobilizes.
A total 180.
It really is. We are looking at a stack of reports today to unpack this. We've got financial analysis from AGF, industry deep dives from BetaKit and Global News.
We also have some really revealing military leadership interviews from CTV and Quinty News.
Right, and regional updates from BOCM. And all of this together describes a defense renaissance that is, frankly, it's startling in its scale.
Startling is the right word. We aren't just talking about, buying a few new pickup trucks for the reserves.
No.
We are talking about a complete overhaul of the industrial strategy, billions in new spending, and a recruitment surge that just defies every demographic trend we've seen in the West.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We need to figure out, why is this happening right now? Who is actually going to build all this new hardware?
Which is more controversial than you might think.
Oh, we're definitely getting into that. And finally, what does this mean for you, the average citizen, and the economy as a whole?
That industrial piece is really the sticky one. Because as we peel this back, we're finding that throwing money at the military is actually the easy part.
Yeah.
Deciding whose factory gets that money. That is where the fight starts.
Well, let's start with the catalyst. Why did the dam finally break? We have this analysis from Greg Valliere over at AGF, and he points directly to the recent State of the Union address in the U.S.
Right. And usually when we analyze the State of the Union, we're looking entirely at the domestic American reaction.
Sure.
But Valliere argues that the real story this time actually happened north of the border. He notes that while the heckling of Donald Trump in the chamber was somewhat docile compared to previous years,
Relatively speaking, yeah.
the geopolitical pressure he's applied to Canada has effectively backfired, or worked, depending entirely on how you view the outcome.
The AGF report actually uses the word thuggery to describe Trump's demands, which is strong language for our financial analysis.
It is. We're just reporting what they wrote, but the outcome of that pressure is undeniable. Instead of shrinking away, Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, has dramatically pivoted.
The numbers are wild.
They are. We are seeing a pledge from the Carney government to hit a 5% benchmark by 2035.
I really want to pause on that number for a second. 5%.
It's massive.
For years, we struggled to hit the NATO minimum of 2%, just dragging our feet, jumping to 5%. That isn't just a budget increase. That is effectively a militarization of the economy.
It's a wartime footing without the actual war. And Valliere's analysis suggests this is essentially a survival mechanism.
How so?
It's Ottawa realizing that if they don't hit these specific numbers that the U.S. administration is demanding, the trade consequences with the U.S. will be absolutely catastrophic.
Ah, I see.
But what's really interesting here is that the Canadian population seems to be moving right along with the government.
Yes, this was the biggest surprise in the data for me. Because we've heard the same narrative for a decade, right? Gen Z doesn't want to serve. Military recruitment is in a death spiral.
That was the accepted wisdom.
But look at these numbers coming from Defense Minister David McGuinty.
It totally defies the global trend. He reported a 13% increase in new recruits to the Canadian Armed Forces over just the past 8 months.
13% in 8 months? That is a statistical anomaly in the Western world right now.
It really is. And McGuinty connects it directly to global uncertainty. But I think there's something a bit deeper in his quote to CTV. He says Canadians are engaged in the project called Canada.
The project called Canada.
Right. It suggests that when the threat becomes tangible, when you see global instability actively threatening your borders or your economic security, the abstract idea of sovereignty becomes very personal.
People want to secure the house they live in.
Exactly.
So, okay, we have the political will, and it looks like we finally have the bodies with this recruitment surge. Now we get to the part that usually bores people to tears, but is actually the most dramatic part of this entire story.
Procurement.
Procurement, the industrial base. If you're going to suddenly spend 5% of your GDP on defense, you're effectively flooding the market with contracts.
A tidal wave of cash.
And suddenly, because of that cash, we have a brand new player in town. And I apologize in advance, but I cannot say this acronym without hearing a guitar riff in my head.
You're talking about AC/DC.
For those about to defend.
We salute you. Yes, the Alliance of Canadian Defense Companies.
It's objectively a great name, but why do they exist? Because we already have CADSI, right? The Canadian Association of Defense and Security Industries. Why fracture the lobbying effort now?
Well, this is the critical tension in the industry right now. CADSI represents the Canadian defense industry as a whole. That includes some of the smaller domestic guys, sure, but it also includes the absolute titans.
Right, the Lockheeds, the Boeings.
General Dynamics, the companies they call the primes.
The massive American multinationals.
Exactly. So the argument from the founders of AC/DC people like Elliot Pence from Dominion Dynamics and Paul Ziad from North Vector is that you simply cannot have a unified voice when your members are competing for the exact same meal.
That makes sense.
They argue that at CADSI, the primes eat first, and the Canadian domestic firms basically get the scraps.
So AC/DC is framing this entirely as a sovereignty issue.
Explicitly. They are arguing very publicly that Canada's new defense targets are completely unobtainable without a strong, unified, purely domestic industrial base.
Right.
They represent the small and medium businesses.
Yeah.
The Canadian-owned folks making drone components, specialized software, ballistics gear, and they feel they are being actively squeezed out of this renaissance by the multinationals.
So it's a David versus Goliath narrative, but playing out inside the military-industrial complex.
Spot on.
But this is where I get a little confused, and I think you listening might too. When we say Canadian company in this context, what does that actually mean in 2026?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question, and frankly, the federal government is really struggling to answer it right now.
Because the Global News Report highlights this new federal strategy. It's a $6.6 billion plan, and the headline goal is to boost contracts awarded to Canadian firms to 70%, up from 43%.
Which sounds fantastic on a bumper sticker. By Canadian.
Right. But Global News points out that the actual definition of a Canadian firm is incredibly messy.
It's what economists call the branch plant problem. Take a company like General Dynamics. They have a massive, massive facility in London, Ontario.
Building the light armored vehicles?
Exactly.
Right.
They employ thousands of Canadian welders, Canadian engineers, local managers. They pay taxes in Canada. But the headquarters, the intellectual property, and the ultimate decision-making power, that's all sitting in the United States.
So under the government's new rules, do they count as Canadian to hit that 70% target?
Currently, yes.
No.
The official government line we saw was that capabilities are defined by operations in Canada, not ownership.
I can hear the folks at AC/DC screaming from here. They would say that's a loophole you could drive a tank through.
Precisely. And Industry Minister Melanie Joly actually seems to agree with the AC/DC view on this. She's pushing back internally. She stated she wants to avoid a branch plant economy.
So what's her proposed solution?
She wants 70% of the actual components to be created in Canada, not just the final assembly.
And that brings us to the IP trap. Intellectual property. This is the part that I think is so easy to overlook. It's not just about who collects the paycheck for turning the wrench on the assembly line. It's about who actually owns the blueprints.
Yes. Wendy Gilmore, who is a former NATO official, gave a really terrifying example to CTV of why this matters so much. She calls it the Leopard tank problem.
Walk us through that, because this blew my mind.
So Canada bought Leopard tanks.
Yeah.
Beautiful machinery.
Great tanks.
We deployed them to Afghanistan. But when they broke down, or when they needed specific armor upgrades for the terrain in Kandahar, Canadian engineers couldn't just pop the hood and fix them.
Because we didn't own the specs.
We didn't own the IP. We literally had to go back to the original German manufacturers to beg for permission or to get the specific proprietary parts just to repair our own tanks while we were actively in a war zone.
That's insane. It's the military equivalent of the right to repair fight over your smartphone or your tractor. If you don't own the IP, you don't really own the equipment. You're effectively just leasing the capability from another country.
Which is a massive strategic vulnerability. And Gilmore points out we are walking into the exact same trap right now with our shipyards.
Ah, the national shipbuilding strategy.
Right. We are building these new ships in Halifax. Irving Shipyards is doing the work. The steel is physically being cut by Canadians, but the underlying design of the ship is British,
Okay.
and the weapon systems going onto the ship are American or European.
So if we get into a major conflict and the countries that own that IP disagree with our foreign policy.
They could technically cut off our supply of spare parts
Right.
or refuse software updates. It's like having a laptop where the manufacturer decides to just turn off your operating system remotely. You're suddenly left with a very expensive, very useless gray steel brick floating in the Atlantic Ocean.
Wow. That context makes AC/DC's whole argument make a lot more sense. It isn't just basic economic protectionism to save a few local jobs. It's actual operational security.
It is.
Speaking of expensive steel bricks, let's transition and talk about the actual shopping list. Because the hardware Canada is buying right now represents a fundamental shift in military doctrine.
A total pivot. It's a shift away from the classic Canadian peacekeeping identity, straight toward power projection.
Let's start underwater. The submarines.
Yes. General Jenny Carignan, the Chief of Defense Staff, she confirmed the plan to finally replace our 4 old Victoria-class submarines, and they are looking at up to 12 new subs.
Okay, going from 4 to 12 is not a replacement. That is a massive fleet expansion.
It's a huge statement of intent. Look, with 4 subs, you can barely keep one operational in the water while the others are constantly in maintenance or transit.
Right.
But 12 subs. That means Canada can have a permanent, stealthy, armed presence in both the Atlantic and the Pacific simultaneously. It completely changes Canada from a coastal patrol nation into a serious blue water navy.
But as big as the sub deal is, it seems almost straightforward compared to the drama happening in the skies. The fighter jet debate. I feel like we've been talking about replacing the old CF-18 since I was literally in high school.
It has been an absolute saga. But according to BetaKit and the industry watchers, it is finally down to the wire. We are looking at the American Lockheed Martin F-35 versus the Swedish Saab Gripen.
And this choice perfectly encapsulates everything we were just talking about: sovereignty versus interoperability.
It is the ultimate test case.
Let's look at the Gripen offer first. The Saab CEO, Michael Johansson, is really leaning into the made in Canada angle, isn't he?
He absolutely knows his audience. He's out there promising 10,000 Canadian jobs. He's promising that domestic companies like Bombardier, CAE, IMP, Aerospace will actually be building these planes on Canadian soil.
So if you are an economic nationalist, or if you are sitting on the board of AC/DC, the Gripen is your dream candidate. You get the jobs, you get the tech transfer, and you get the IP.
Exactly. But then you go and talk to the actual pilots and the military commanders who have to fly them into combat.
Right, the Quinta News piece. They interviewed Lieutenant Colonel Craig Greeley. He's the commanding officer of the 8 Air Maintenance Squadron at CFB Trenton. And he did not mince his words.
Not at all. He is firmly, unapologetically in the F-35 camp. And his argument is just pure operational pragmatism. He boils it all down to one word: interoperability.
Can you define that for the listener who isn't steeped in military jargon? What does interoperability actually look like in a modern 2026 battlefield?
It's so much more than just being able to refuel from the same allied tanker. It's entirely about data.
Okay.
The F-35 isn't just a plane. It is basically a flying supercomputer. It sucks in massive amounts of data from satellites, from ground troops, from naval ships, and from other F-35s, and it shares all of it in real time across a secure network.
And the U.S. uses it.
The U.S. uses it, the U.K. uses it, Australia uses it, our closest allies. If Canada shows up to a joint fight in a Swedish Gripen, we are functionally operating outside of that core network.
So we'd be the Android user in the group text.
That is uncomfortably accurate. I mean, we might be able to send basic text messages, but we aren't getting the high-res photos. We aren't getting the real-time location drops.
Right.
And Greeley's point is that in a high-intensity modern conflict, being outside that data bubble will get your pilots killed. He actually called the policy shift toward high-end gear like the F-35 music to the military's ears.
So the trade-off is incredibly stark. Do we build a domestic industry and create 10,000 jobs with the Gripen? Or do we ensure our pilots can survive a war seamlessly alongside our allies with the F-35?
That is the brutal calculus sitting on the Prime Minister's desk. Now, General Carignan stated they are currently waiting for the decision on the Gripen review.
But we've already committed to 16 F-35s, right?
We have. So it really feels like the momentum is heavily with the Americans, simply because The reality of the NATO alliance practically demands it.
It's fascinating. Now, I want to zoom out from the specific machines, the jets and the subs, to look at the actual map of Canada, because spending this kind of money fundamentally changes the economic geography of the country.
It does. And the VOCM report shows that Atlantic Canada, in particular, is bracing for an absolute boom.
Yeah, Premier Tony Wakeham over in Newfoundland and Labrador is certainly positioning for it. He flat out declared that his province is built for defense.
And objectively, he's not wrong.
Geography is destiny.
Geography is everything in defense. Look at Five Wing Goose Bay, look at their deep water ports. If Ottawa is suddenly deeply worried about securing the North Atlantic or countering Russian presence in the Arctic, Newfoundland is essentially an unsinkable aircraft carrier sitting right where you need it.
And you mentioned the Arctic. You cannot talk about Canadian defense today without talking about the melting ice.
Wakeham made a very nuanced point on this that goes way beyond just building military bases. He argued that true Arctic sovereignty isn't just about sticking a flag in the ice or putting soldiers on patrol. It fundamentally requires heavy investment in the northern communities themselves.
Meaning civilian infrastructure. Housing, medical services, roads.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because you cannot effectively defend a massive territory if the civilian population living there is in constant crisis or lacks basic infrastructure.
It has to be integrated.
Right. And General Carignan actually backed this up. She noted that the East Coast Navy plays a huge role in projecting power up into the Arctic. She called it a joint fight.
Which implies that this massive new military budget might end up subsidizing civilian social infrastructure in the north, simply because the military needs the roads and the power grids to support their new bases.
It's a total holistic mobilization of the state apparatus.
So let's try to synthesize all of this for you listening. We've thrown a lot of acronyms, a lot of billions of dollars, and competing theories at you. If you had to boil this down, what is the big picture takeaway?
I look at all these sources, and I see a triple pivot happening simultaneously.
Okay, break that triple pivot down for us.
First, you have the political pivot. We are aggressively moving from a nation that, frankly, tried to do the bare minimum to stay in NATO, to a nation now pledging 5% of its GDP to defense. That is a fundamental rewriting of our national social contract.
Oh.
We are actively choosing guns over, well, maybe not over butter, but we're buying a massive amount of guns.
And the second pivot.
The industrial pivot.
Right.
This is the rise of AC/DC and that fierce push for sovereign capability.
Yeah.
We are seeing a real rejection of the standard globalization of defense procurement.
The pushback against the branch plants.
Yes. There is a strong faction demanding we make it here, own the IP here, and control it here.
And the third piece.
The military pivot. We are transitioning away from a lightly armed peacekeeping and constabulary force straight into a high-end heavy metal fighting force. 12 submarines. Stealth fighters.
Power projection.
Exactly.
Hey.
This is a military being designed to fight a peer adversary in a major war, not just to patrol a UN ceasefire line.
And for the average person listening to this on their commute, why should they care? Beyond the obvious geopolitical anxiety.
They should care because it's about the domestic economy. This is billions upon billions of their tax dollars.
Right.
The fight over who gets those dollars, whether the money flows to the multinational branch plants in London, Ontario, or the local startups championed by AC/DC, that fight is going to determine the shape and strength of the Canadian economy for the next 20 years.
Which brings us to a bit of a paradox to end on, and this has honestly been nagging at me throughout this entire deep dive.
Let's hear it.
We are spending all this money and having all these debates in order to be sovereign, to stand on our own 2 feet and not be pushed around by Donald Trump or anyone else.
That is the stated goal.
We want to build a domestic industry so we aren't completely reliant on the U.S., but in order for our military to actually be effective in a modern war, we are forced to buy equipment like the F-35 that requires us to be more deeply integrated with the U.S. military than ever before.
It's what you might call the sovereignty trap.
The sovereignty trap. I mean, if we build a so-called sovereign industry that produces gear that only functions when it's plugged directly into the American military data network, have we actually achieved true independence?
Or have we just found a much more expensive way to remain dependent?
Exactly.
That is the exact question that should be keeping our policymakers up at night right now. Are we building our own shield, or are we just paying a drastically higher premium for an insurance policy from Washington?
It's a sobering thought to leave you with. The Canadian defense renaissance is definitely here. The massive checks are already being written. But the core question of who truly controls our security is still very much up in the air.
It absolutely is.
Well, thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Keep a close eye on those procurement contracts in the news because that is where the real future of this country is being written. We will catch you on the next one.